Hello, welcome to the LIC Ireland Webinar. I'm Mark Ryder, General Manager for LIC Europe. So we're here to share a couple of things from New Zealand that we think are quite relevant to Ireland. With the industries being so similar and the clean green image that we have sitting behind our brands globally, it's hugely important to both countries. So as soon as something happens in New Zealand that brings that image under question, New Zealand's very quick to react, and also very proud of the fact that we model our stuff on science. So we take the emotion out of it and look for scientific ways to address problems and to also maintain our position as a very efficient producer of dairy product from grass-based systems. So 5 years ago, LIC identified some of those challenges ahead and took a proactive approach. And that's when Tony Franson, who will be talking to us tonight, joined the team, and he heads up our environment and welfare part of our R&D team in New Zealand. Tony's involved in a lot of things across the industry and also collaborations outside the industry, working with government and the red meat sector and the Resilient Dairy program. But he's going to be talking to us tonight about one of his outputs from his team over the last 5 years, which is Hoofprint. He'll be telling us more about that soon. And also we have Noelle Fox joining us as well. Now, Noelle was born and bred in Ireland, but at the moment based in Canterbury in the South Island in New Zealand. She works for the LIC FarmWise team down there, and she's been very much involved with the environment management software overseer, but also worked closely with Environment Canterbury on their nitro plan. So we'll be hearing from her shortly. But also someone that probably won't need a hell of a lot of introduction to you, Aidan Brennan from the Irish Farmers Journal, will be facilitating the webinar and be ensuring that questions are asked that are on the tip of all the Irish tongue. So to make it to get that Irish focus out of the webinar, Aidan will be leading that. So without any more to say, I'll hand over to Aidan to get things started. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for the introduction. As you say, the environment is on the top of most farmers' tongues, whether they're in Ireland or New Zealand. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what our two speakers have to say today. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to Noelle Fox, and Noelle is going to start off with her presentation, and we'll have questions at the end.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Noelle Fox, and yes, I'm originally from Mullingar, County Westmeath, so beef to the heel like the Mullingar heifer, but I've relocated here to Christchurch in 2012. When I came back to New Zealand in 2012, I worked for Dairy NZ as the consulting officer in North Canterbury before joining LIC FarmWise based here in North Canterbury. I joined FarmWise in 2015. I'm a certified farm environmental auditor, and I've been conducting farm environmental audits on farm and also supporting my clients to implement their farm environmental plans on farm. So their systems and processes are in place around to meet their environmental targets. So just to give you a little bit of a quick overview about the Canterbury region. So the population of New Zealand is about 5 million people in New Zealand, with 1.2 million of them living on the South Island. The population of Canterbury, the 630,000 people who live in Canterbury. And the latitude of Christchurch, where I'm based, is similar to Nice. So in terms of the scale between Ireland and New Zealand, Ireland's about 3.8 times smaller than New Zealand. And Canterbury region is twice the size of Leinster. But in terms of the dairy industry and how relevant Canterbury is to the dairy industry, we have 10% of the dairy cows here in Canterbury producing 20% of the milk. So this morning I just want to give you a brief helicopter overview of what is actually happening here in Canterbury and what's been going on in the environmental space over the last 10 years. So over the last 10 years, we've had the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan and the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. And that's been something that's been implemented at regional level to address the problems around land use intensification. So under the Land and Water Regional Plan that we've been operating under for the last 10 years, there's a suite of nutrient management tools that require regulation around land use. And they require both nutrient loss calculations plus farm environmental plans. So hopefully this morning I'll be able to give you a bit of an idea of what actually that means on farm. So nutrient loss calculation it is what it says in the tin. It really looks at the difference between the nutrient inputs on your farm, so where your nitrogen is coming from in terms of your fertiliser, your imported feed and your clover fixation that's happening on the property. And then it looks at your outputs, so your meat, your milk, your feed, anything that is being produced on the farm, and does a calculation between the inputs and outputs, therefore giving you a surplus. This surplus is what we're really interested in terms of the nutrient management, and the surplus is really influenced by farm management practices and non-farm management practices. So every dairy farm will have a unique characteristics that influences the end leaching risk. There'll be both physical factors such as the soil type and the climate, but there'll also be management factors such as stock and rate, the amount of fertiliser you actually import, your pasture and imported feed, and the pasture types you actually have on the farm. So that's the first thing we look at. And in terms of doing that, the tool that's used in New Zealand and used for nutrient management budgets is Overseer. So Overseer, as I said, is a computer model, and the information entered is as per the slide. So you're looking at the physical factors of the farm. So, however, like all computerised models, Overseer does have its limitations, and there's a couple of factors that people really need to consider when they're looking at Overseer. So it's very sensitive to the data that's entered. So quality of data going in equals the quality of the information you get out. It's also a long-term model, so it doesn't give you a flow of nutrients on a daily basis, but it's looking at a long-term average or an annual basis. It uses long-term averages, so average rainfall, etc., and not just annual rainfall. So it assumes that the farm system is in balance, so everything, all the information that you're entering is correct in terms of if you're saying your cows are going to produce X amount of milk, it's assuming that there's enough feed in the system to do that. And like all models, it actually assumes that you're already at good management practices for your on-farm practices. So around effluent application, fertiliser application and irrigation application. So if you do make any changes around your on-farm practices around good management, or even addressing good management practices, Overseer will not take that into account because it actually assumes you're already there. So the second part of what we've been operating under in terms of the Land and Water Regional Plan is farm environmental plans. And the farm environmental plan is a much more holistic overview of the farm. So this model, this piece looks at continuous improvement. It's simply not a one-off plan, and it is externally audited. So the process used by most farmers, and this is a process that farmers are really familiar with in everything they do. It's a plan, do, review, monitor, implement, change. And that is the same principle that's been applied to the farm environmental plan. So it's really just looking at what's actually happening on farm holistically, every part of your farm system, and how that may impact the environment. So the farm environmental plans are audited, and they're audited externally. And the audit grades are based on the information that's provided by the farmer, whether that's in the form of on-farm records or a farm system discussion. And that will drive the outcome. So farmers will be graded on an A, B, C or D outcome, and depending on how well they grade, how often the audits will be conducted. It's quite important to note though that there is farmers cannot continuously get a C or D grade, which are at the lower end of the grades, and they must show that they're improving towards the top end of the grades, which are A's and B's. So some of the components of the farm environmental audit. So there is 4 main components that are put together to compile the farm environmental audit. So your farm data and maps, your environmental risk assessment. So that's just doing a holistic risk assessment of any of the hazards that are on farm that may result in a negative environmental outcome. Looking at good management practices that are already in place, and then having smart actions for improvement. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time-bound actions that the farmer will implement. So as I said, it's a holistic approach around the 6 main management areas on farm. So we have water use and irrigation efficiency, effluent, so how much effluent is being produced, the storage and the application of the effluent, your nutrients, so what fertiliser you're bringing into the farm, when that's been applied, how that's been applied and the efficiencies of that. Your waterways and biodiversity, so ensuring that you're maintaining your waterways. and improving biodiversity. You have a component around land and soil, so looking at your soil management, your soil fertility, and then the last factor is around waste and storage on farm. So realistically, why would this be beneficial to farmers? This is about cutting the fat and not cutting the muscle. This is about trying to eliminate the waste within the system that result in negative environmental outcomes. So from a farmer's point of view, there's huge benefits for increasing efficiency on farm and reducing loss, and improving the productivity of your business. So where to next? Recently, on September 3rd, the new National Policy Statement for Fresh Water Management came into play, and that is a national policy, and that has come in over the top of the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan. So councils at regional levels have till 2025 to implement the new policies introduced in that. And there's a little bit of fear and uncertainty about how that will look. So the biggest thing that's coming at us straight away is the NCAP, and that's coming sooner than the other policy changes outlined in the National Freshwater Management Policy, and those changes and limits on nitrogen will take effect for the season 2021-2022. So, but just to give you a little bit of overview of what farmers are actually doing, as I said, this has been going on in Canterbury for 10 years, and there's been a lot of focus on improving environmental outcomes. So Dairy NZ have been doing quite a bit of work in this field. There's been a number of high profile projects on the go, including the Forages for Reduced Nitrogen Leaching Research Project and the project in the Selwyn Hines catchment, where the farmers looked at the strategies of how they would reduce their total output. So there's a number of strategies outlined on the screen, and some of them include moving to lower application rates, making sure you're getting the best bang for your buck when you actually apply your nitrogen, having a monthly nitrogen fertiliser plan and monitoring, possibly skipping a few paddocks out of the rotation, determining based on your feed budget if you need a surplus. Do you actually need to drive a surplus at this point in time, or are you lifting grazing residuals? So do you actually need to apply your N? What's the point? Like, why are you applying it? Where's it going? How are you using it in your system? Looking at applying less nitrogen to your effluent areas, so making sure that you're taking account of all the nitrogen that's actually on your property. So one of the key things for most people is around their pasture walks and feed wedge, and just really being focused on how much feed we need, making sure our whole farm system is in balance. So looking at our soil fertility, addressing any other factors that may be limiting your pasture production. There's no point putting on nitrogen fertiliser if your limiting factor is going to be your other soil fertility nutrients, possibly poor pasture quality, and a focus on increasing clover in your pasture swards as we move towards regrassing. So that's a little bit of what is happening in a nutshell, and very brief from me this morning, but I hope it gives you a good overview of the journey that we've been on here in Canterbury and some of the tools that people are actually implementing on farm. Thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions at the end from Aidan or any of the panellists. Thank you.
Thanks, Noelle. Thanks very much for a very informative presentation. So as you say, we'll take questions at the end after Tony's presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Tony Franson, the Manager for the Environment and Welfare section within LIC.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Franson. I am the Environment and Welfare Manager at LIC, and as Mark said, I'm in the R&D team. So Noelle's already jumped into that. There's a lot going on in the water quality space, particularly in Canterbury, but all across New Zealand. And with the National Policy Statement, there will be a greater emphasis on nutrient management, and particularly nitrogen. But we also have greenhouse gases, and last year the government put out the Zero Carbon Bill, which has targets for methane reductions in the order of 10% by 2030 and somewhere between 24 and 47% by 2050. So nitrogen and methane are going to be the big topics that we're dealing with at a farm level. So where is the focus? In a pastoral system, we know that the carbon dioxide component to this is cyclical. So it's not actually a sink or a source of carbon dioxide, it is just going around. The big issue is around the methane that's coming out and the additional warming potential that sits behind that over that short time that it's there. The other area of concern for both nitrous oxide emissions for greenhouse gases and for urinary nitrogen risk of damage to waterways is around that urinary nitrogen. So this is the focus area that we've been looking at to go, what difference can we make around the genetics and breeding, and can we look at things slightly differently to make sure we're getting the right efficiencies we need on farm. So in general, we've always had a good focus on driving for efficiency, and I'd say we've been very good at pushing for total milk production up in the top area here. We've always understood what our herd size is, or cow numbers, and we've been driving for production per cow and trying to get efficiency gains there. As we bring environment into the picture, we could look at footprint per animal, but that can drive the wrong incentives. You end up with a cow that's actually not producing the levels that she should be, and so the footprint is not being utilised as efficiently as possible. So we've decided to focus here on footprint per kilogram of product, and we look at it in terms of kilograms urinary nitrogen or kilograms enteric methane. So that's what we've been focusing on. And what we've coined is this new brand called Hoofprint. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of what we're calculating with our Hoofprint model and what we're displaying back to farmers to be able to make informed decisions. So the Hoofprint model, it starts out with the individual animals' breeding values. So here on the left, we've got live weight, volume, fat, protein, fertility and longevity. And in next year's version, we're looking to include gestation length as well. So that's the breeding values that already exist for those animals and are used for other indexes. We then take them and put them through a lifetime model, which is based on the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Inventory methodology, which is how the New Zealand government, or MPI, calculates greenhouse gas emissions for the country. But we've adapted this to make it an individual animal model and looking at it over its whole lifetime. So we're not just looking at when the cow is producing milk, we're looking at what does it cost to replace her, what sort of lifespan is she likely to have, what replacement does that drive, so and how many days during that lifetime is she going to be producing and at what level. And then from that, we get what is their total lifetime milk production, urinary nitrogen emissions, and greenhouse gas emissions. And then we can start to calculate that index based on production per kilogram of loss. So when we put that into a graphical form, if we look at urinary nitrogen in the first instance, across the bottom here, we have the New Zealand breeding worth system from late last year. This was looking at the bulls that were marketed here in New Zealand into the 2020 season and comparing them against the genetics that were put through in terms of the last 10 years of elite breeding genetics. What do those bulls look like when we run them through this model? And so what we can see here is that the higher BW animals do have a lower urinary nitrogen per kilogram of milk solid output. And over on the left-hand side, the low genetic merit animals, they have a lot higher environmental footprint per kilogram of product. And so this relates, especially in the lower part of the graph here, to a relationship of about every 10 BW units, we get 1.7 grams, so less urinary nitrogen per kilogram of milk solid. And you can see the graph is slightly curving up here. And so this area here where the lower efficiency is actually really been driven by low fertility and low longevity animals, that upwards curve, because you're driving up replacement rate more significantly and you're not getting the number of lactations out of the animal that you need to repay those 2 years of growth. So that's a really important factor, is making sure that we are still getting that good fertility through it. So if we look at the premier size daughter-proven product that LIC offers here in New Zealand, over the last 30 years, that's resulted in a 16% reduction in urinary nitrogen per kilogram of milk solid. So this is all modelled across all of the breeds that we offer, so Jersey, Friesian and Kiwi cross, and you can see that consistent trend downwards as we've had a solid rate of genetic gain through that time. So that's really cool to see. And now that we've got more, I suppose, vision and awareness on what we need to be doing, we can look at how can we accelerate this genetic gain in this area as well. So let's jump across to the other side and have a look at enteric methane. And you'll see that this graph is very similar to the one that I just showed before. So again, these high genetic merit animals to the right of the graph here have a much lower enteric methane emission per kilogram of product. So we're getting a lot more efficiency out of them for the feed that they eat. We're getting more production and less wastage into the methane. And so the relationship in this instance is around about for every 10 BW units, we're getting about 2 grams less methane per kilogram of milk solid. So this is important, even though we're looking at intensity per kilogram of product. If there is a cap that comes on, as that cap gets squeezed down on farmers, or if the price of emissions goes up, you're going to be wanting to still produce as much as you can under that cap to be able to afford to pay for whatever that compliance cost is. And so really driving for efficiency under that cap is important. And so if we look at what does this mean for the 30 years of breeding, again, this time we've had a 13% reduction in enteric methane over that 30-year time period from our daughter-proven premier size product. So that's what we can gain from genetics. Now, what does this look like? What's driving those outputs? So if we have a look at the 6 traits that go into that model, the Hoofprint model, each of those traits roughly has a standard distribution around the average. So what we've done for the modelling here is just looked at what does it mean if we were to focus on any one of those traits and change that by 1 standard deviation upwards to look at what impact would that have. So if we look at it, so there's just the breeding value averages for New Zealand. So if we look at it in terms of production per hectare, if we were to increase live weight without increasing milk production or longevity or fertility, we would have a negative effect because we're going to be putting more of that feed per hectare into maintenance and growing animals rather than producing milk. So that's a negative effect. Whereas if we're able to increase milk solid yields without increasing live weight, we can have a positive effect there on milk solids per hectare, getting that feed into milk production. So that gives you an indication of what the impacts are there. What I will also point out is that fertility and longevity, the way it's run in the model, fertility is actually counted for in longevity as well. So fertility by itself is just looking at days in milk for that lactation. So how early in the calving period is she likely to come into milk, and longevity would include about 2/3 of that would be around cows not getting in calf. So fertility is probably closer to around 1.5% to 2% in total. It's just split up over those two. And if we look at the environmental footprint as a result, so you can see that the red is indicated, or the negative effect is indicated in red. So live weight has a big contribution. If we go for bigger animals without getting that efficiency, without increasing that milk solids yield, we're going to have a negative effect on the environment. So really key to see there, live weight, production per kilogram of live weight is a key driver. The difference between methane and urinary nitrogen here, basically your fat to protein ratio on the animal. So if nitrogen is your key focus, then the protein yields of the cows are going to have a far greater impact. But again, you can see the contribution across the board, driving for those milk solids traits, keeping live weight at a sustainable level and making sure you're not compromising on fertility and longevity. So how have we communicated this to the farmers? So we've used the Hoofprint symbol where we've got urinary nitrogen on one side and methane on the other, and we've created a 10-point scale. So 10 being the most efficient animals, 1 being the least efficient animals. And we've done this on the last 10 years of dairy genetics in New Zealand. So these are bulls that have been registered through our sire proving schemes and the equivalents from the other companies, and then ranked them from 1 to about 4,500 and put them on this bell-shaped curve to go. The top 2% of bulls, they will get a 10-star, next 5% will get a 9-star, and so on down through the population. And we've excluded any that were for other purposes such as short gestation length, etc. And so what this means is that in the catalogue that we've used, Bulls that are showing a 10 and a 9 star really are the elite animals. They're the elite of the elite. So where can we go? We've got science going on already in the resilient dairy space, which is looking at what else can we do around health and welfare indicators, which will hopefully improve our longevity breeding values. So as we've seen, that longevity is a major contributor in that space, especially when you start getting towards the negative end. It's going to severely impact you. We also have a research project underway looking at the sire proving scheme bulls, and seeing if there is genetic variation in methane emissions. So potentially over the coming years there may be a methane emissions breeding value or a feed utilisation breeding value that may be able to be included. And Dairy NZ has a program looking at whether if there's differences in nitrogen partitioning, and so potentially around that nitrogen space there could be a urine volume, frequency, bladder size, or some form of breeding value we can put in there. So cool science on the way, not here yet, but we're looking to include it as soon as we can. So really what I want to say is this is a new tool to help demonstrate environmental efficiency. Should be available in the genetics catalogue, available for the coming season. And regardless of what your regulation is around nitrogen caps or methane targets, etc., animal efficiency is still going to be a key component to making sure you're running a profitable system. And just keep an eye out for the research that's underway. There's some cool stuff going on, and this is going to help us with overall sustainability in the farm system. So really cool to see when that comes online. So that's it from me, and happy to take any questions.
Great stuff. Thanks, Tony. I might start off with you with a couple of questions first. What's the correlation between Hoofprint and BW currently? I know there's been good gains made over the last 30 years, but it looked in that one of those graphs that we'd say your high BW bulls, the rate of progress was actually lower for those relative to the very low BW bulls. Just asking, what's the correlation there between BW and Hoofprint for either nitrogen or methane?
Yep, so I've jumped to the methane graph there. So you can see that is directly correlating. So the Hoofprint is up the vertical axis there, BW across the horizontal. So you can see it's quite close. I haven't got the exact number in front of me, but it's definitely above an R squared of 0.9, probably 0.95-ish. And it's just that curve going on at the top end is really where that replacement rate starts getting unsustainable because you're not getting the cows back in calf. But for the rest of it, there's a pretty, I would say, almost linear relationship, and things that are causing the difference there is just your relationship between your fat and protein ratios and your longevity versus production traits, and that causes that little bit of up and down around it.
Thanks, Tony. And is there an end goal in sight for Hoofprint in terms of, is there a target for kilos of methane per kilos of milk solids, or kilos of urinary nitrogen loss per kilos of milk solids?
Yep, so I've done some projections out for our 2050 methane target that we've got as a country, and projecting the rates of genetic gain in each of the individual traits is still estimating that we can almost continue in a linear relationship like we have for the last 30 years. That trend there is still predicted to be available. And that's just solely on the production and efficiency traits that we've focused on. If we're able to bring new traits in around methane or urinary frequency and things like that, there might be the option of actually dropping that slope a bit lower. So that'd be quite cool.
And just one more for you, Tony, before we move on back to Noel, but the reasons for the gain, and that's very prominent, but is that due to smaller cows over the last 30 years, or where is that efficiency coming from?
No, I'd say the live weight has been relatively constant, but it's been the increase in production yield. On the nitrogen side of it, I'd say some of the driver has been the value of protein. So as farmers have been breeding for the higher protein animals, that's increased the rate of gain on that side. But I'd say it's been a key driver, kilograms of milk solids per kilogram live weight. If you put that in here, it's very much contributing to it. So it's all around that efficiency of converting feed into milk solids rather than just maintaining the cow.
So forgive me now for asking maybe a stupid question, but is it not the case that you can't produce something from nothing? So because those cows are now producing more milk solids, they're obviously eating more to get that. But are you suggesting that they're partitioning more of that feed intake towards production and less towards urine or less wastage in terms of protein loss through into urine?
Yep, you're right. As an individual animal, they might be consuming more, but it's still the same amount required for maintaining, and the extra is all going to production. So essentially what you're doing is you're diluting the maintenance component over the total feed.
Okay, thank you. Noel, over to you for a moment. Obviously, you mentioned in your presentation that there's been 10 years of these farm environmental plans. Are they working in terms of improving water quality in Canterbury?
Look, I don't have the data in front of me, Aidan, but I can give you a broad overview around what's actually been happening. So when I came back in 2012, this hadn't even really hit the ground. And Tony Franson and I both were in Dairy NZ at the time, and Tony was driving some of these things for dairy farmers at a national and regional level. So yes, the farm environmental plans, when they started, people were quite nervous and afraid of them and worried about the impact they'd actually have on their business. But I think it's quite important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here, because now these are actually embedded into how people farm. It's the same way as they'd have a feed budget, they now have their farm environmental plan. And these things are working, and we are seeing good efficiency changes on farm. And recent data released by Dairy NZ using Dairybase has shown that profitability on the farms in the Selwyn and Hine catchment, which are working towards reduced nitrogen inputs in terms of fertiliser, that hasn't affected profitability. So that's a genuinely good news story for people. Their businesses are still as efficient as they were before, plus their environmental footprint has decreased. Now, will we see as you know, we're not going to see these things happen in the morning and significant changes tomorrow morning. It's going to take time for this to flow through the system at an environmental level, but we are seeing positive change in that area.
And in terms of uptake of these plans, our overseer, is it mandatory, and are all farmers complying?
Yes, it is mandatory. A lot of these farm environmental plans, so all dairy farmers must have them as terms and conditions of supply. So as you know, we have a couple of milk processors, but here in Canterbury, the two main players are Sinlay and Fonterra. So as terms and conditions of supply, you must have a farm environmental plan and an annual nutrient budget completed. So under the Land and Water Regional Plan, everybody had to comply with having a nutrient budget done through overseer by a certified nutrient management advisor and your farm environmental plan. So it's standard, it just has to be done.
In terms of the audits that are done in these farms, what's the penalty for non-compliance? Is it the fact that the milk company won't take your milk, or is there some other? Is it a financial punishment? Or
the audits are paid for by the farmer, so the farmer must organise to have his audit completed, and they must pay for that directly. So if you get an A grade, you don't have to be re-audited for 3 years. If you get a B grade, it's 2 years. If you get a C grade, it's 1 year, and if you get a D grade, it's 6 months. Now, a lot of the audits are done as collectives, and the collectives are formed like an irrigation scheme, maybe one of the collectives that's formed. So as part of the irrigation scheme environmental management strategy, they're not allowing the farmers under that irrigation scheme to get a C or D grade. And the results of the audits are reported back to ECAN as a collective. So people aren't standing on their own. Example, in Colredon, which is part of Hornui, there's 80 farms there, 80 dairy farms that are receiving water from Muri Irrigation. So a Muri Irrigation report back to ECAN the outcomes of the audits. If you're a repeat offender in that area and you're continuously getting a C or D grade, not alone do you have to pay for the audit either annually or every 6 months, there is you will be removed from that collective, and you will have to report your environmental results to ECAN as an individual. So there's enough of a carrot and a stick there for people to go, well, the safety in numbers, and collectively as a group we're all working together to improve environmental outcomes.
There's also the threat that the irrigation scheme turns your water off for a number of days during the summer, which is a big incentive for the farmer to stay on side with the irrigation scheme and their audits.
Yeah, and moving forward, it's a term and condition of supply, so moving forward, potentially your milk company could say, no, we're not collecting your milk.
And on the ground, Noelle, what's the attitude of the farmers towards these new environmental regulations?
Look, as I said, back in 2012 when I started with Dairy NZ, there was a lot of fear and anxiety around what this would mean, and people are like, oh, you know, do I have to give away my firstborn now to continue to operate my business the way I used to? But I think it's really, really important that the sustainability conversation isn't just about environmental sustainability. We simply must have profitable businesses to have sustainability, but sustainability must extend towards the people, the environment, the cows. The whole system and the business must be sustainable for this to work. And I think the implementation of this on the ground has been very successful in ensuring that we can continue to have sustainable businesses, but also for the people who are operating the farm, that the paperwork and the compliance side doesn't become so overwhelming that they simply don't engage with it. So I think it's been a huge success in that from that perspective.
Tony, I might just go back to you for a moment. You mentioned in your slide, and I was interested to hear it because we don't hear that too often in Ireland, about the importance of cow size for environmental efficiency. What would you say to Irish farmers who are concerned about the environment and, you know, wondering what they can do in terms of their own breeding decisions to make themselves more environmentally sustainable? What advice would you give?
Yep. So I mean the easiest back of the envelope calculation is kilograms milk solids per kilogram live weight. Are these cows actually producing what they need? The other thing, what I've said through my presentation, is it's all based around the pastoral system. So when you start importing supplements, the carbon footprint of those supplements starts going up. So your footprint per kilogram milk solid starts going up. So you need to be thinking about what's the footprint of the whole system as well. So what we've done in terms of the modelling, we want to see the genetic diversity. So we've simplified the system. But you've got to remember that out there in the paddock or out there on the farm, the different feeds are going to have an impact as well. So think about that. And then really, I suppose it comes down to the individual farmer about what cow is suitable for their system, based on the infrastructure they've got as well. So you'll have lumpy costs in there, the dairy shed, for example. What's the most efficient animal to be putting through that shed? But what I'd still say is, you know, pasture is our cheapest source of feed. You want to utilise that as much as possible. You want an animal that can utilise that and then convert as much of their feed that they consume into milk, and that's through the kilograms of milk solids per kilogram live weight pathway.
And is there a difference? You mentioned breed as being important there. Is there a difference in breed, and which breeds are higher in their footprint?
So there is a correlation between live weight breeding value and hoofprint. So the lighter animals generally have a smaller hoofprint or are more efficient, and that's purely just by, I'm going to say it again, kilograms milk solids per kilogram live weight. It's such a key component there. Just getting more of that feed consumed out into the vat rather than wasted through gas or urine.
Tony, where do you see Hoofprint going long term? Are farmers going to use this instead of looking at BW when choosing bulls? I'm
not 100% sure what it's going to look like in the future. There's already a close correlation between Hoofprint and BW. I'd say the two differences with the systems is BW is all come back to the common metric of dollar value, whereas Hoofprint doesn't include the dollar or economic value. Hoofprint's looking at the environmental footprint or wastage. So I suppose as there's a price put onto greenhouse gas emissions or a price put onto nitrogen to waterways, etc., there is the opportunity that two of them might come together into a single index. So whether if that's just an environmental metric being put into BW or more economics put into Hoofprint, not sure. But I think I can't see the two diverging. I can only see them coming more together.
Noel, in relation to lower nitrogen levels, is this going to result in less grass being grown or less pasture being grown, and are farmers as a result of that going to have to bring in more supplement, which might have a higher environmental footprint?
This is not actually about looking at growing less grass. It's about deciding how much of a surplus you actually need to drive on your farm. Like if you are applying nitrogen, heavy rates of nitrogen or a consistently high rate of nitrogen all during the spring, and you take your silage that you need for the winter, but then you're out your residuals are rising, or you have to keep on mowing to keep on top of residuals, you're actually driving a surplus there within the farm system, within your feed wedge, that you don't actually really need. It's costing you time, and it's costing you money to put someone on a tractor to go out and address residuals when you are artificially increasing them through higher rates of nitrogen.
Okay, well, I think at this point I'm going to call the session to a close. I'd like to thank our two speakers, both Noel Fox and Tony Franson, for a really informative presentation today. I think the one thing that struck me throughout both presentations was the similarity between the New Zealand farmers' predicament in terms of environment and sustainability, and the Irish farmers' predicament in terms of the same kind of issues. It's about methane, it's about nitrogen losses. And as an industry, as both pastoral dairy farmers, both industries should be working together to solve these problems. And I think sessions like tonight are a great aid to that. So I'd like to thank LIC for bringing this together. And finally, again, just like to thank our two speakers, Noel and Tony.